There we go. Okay, good, we're recording. So it is in chapter 3 that Strobel moves on to documentary evidence, talks about the Pinto, the exploding Pinto, how he found the internal Ford documents, and that described how Ford was going to produce the car because it would be cheaper to pay for the deaths and injuries than it would to redesign and reproduce the car. And then he moves in page 80 into the questions he had about those documents and how they applied to the Bible. And these were questions like, could they have been counterfeited? They had been photocopied a bunch of times before he got them. Could they have been complete forgeries, the signatures on them? Could they be forged? Could they have been tampered with in any way? And how could he be certain that copies of these internal Ford documents were down the line from the originals? How could he be certain that these copies were good enough to run with the story? And those documents passed through, I'm sure, a number of investigative tests. And the article ran, and the whole thing, blew, and it was an enormous story back in the 70s. And Ford was penalized heavily for what they had done. Strobel writes on page 81, first full paragraph, second sentence, when I hold a Bible in my hands, essentially I'm holding copies of ancient historical records. The original manuscripts of the biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all the other books of the Old and New Testaments have long ago crumbled into dust. So how can I be sure that these modern day versions, the end product of countless copying throughout the ages, bear any resemblance to what the authors originally wrote? And in addition, how can I tell if these 4 biographies are telling the whole story? These are the 2 questions of the Bible. These are the 2 questions of interpreting Scripture. Still letting people in. And I'll summarize those questions again. Question number 1, the 2 key questions with regard to Holy Scripture. The first question, it's on page 81, is, how can I tell that these copies, after copies, after copies, after copies, are accurate? And how can I tell that they accurately reflect the historical record? The second part is, how can I know if they're telling the whole story, or if the activities of the early church, even in the first, say, several centuries, have specifically worked to exclude certain things that didn't fit with their narrative in the way that they saw Jesus. To this end, he began interviewing Bruce Metzger, PhD. The significance of Bruce Metzger in the field of New Testament studies cannot be overstated. Metzger, and it's like the book says, if you read any scholarly article, journal article, paper, or book, you will find Bruce Metzger's name in the citations. This guy is a paragon, along with F.F. Bruce and some other guys. An absolute paragon of New Testament studies. People may take issue from time to time, if they dare, with individual suppositions of Metzger, but nobody denies the quality of his work. His credentials are laid out in the book on page 82, and I don't need to read through them, but they are mighty impressive. And it's his connection to Tyndale House at Cambridge in England is also the connection to Dr. Vels, who did his New Testament PhD work at Cambridge, and who knows Dr. Metzger as well.
Pastor, I have a question actually about these scholars. I wonder if for us, is there typically any doctrinal component to what these scholarship efforts, I mean, I don't know if they're always just looking at, oh, this is the history of this document. Do we ever have to be concerned when we're talking about people who are outside of our church body or who have different beliefs? I mean, is there some component from that side that we need to be concerned about or be aware of?
Yeah, so everything is theology. And particularly when it deals with the Bible or any topic in the Bible, it's theology. So the work that people do always is theological. So when we take, for example, the works of Erasmus, and we'll talk about him a little bit, and his influence on Greek and Latin, actually, scholarship from the 16th, 17th centuries. Erasmus, you have to understand, first and foremost, was a Roman Catholic. That informs his work. Jerome, in creating the Vulgata in the 4th century, Roman Catholic, a 4th century Roman Catholic, which is different from, well, in some ways different from a 17th century Roman Catholic. Martin Luther, right, produces a German Bible. Well, he's clearly Lutheran. So, yeah. So the answer is yes. And you'll find, for example, in Bible study notes, if you go pick up a Bible from Amazon, or you pick it up from Barnes and Noble, those study notes for any Bible that didn't come from Concordia Publishing House will be reform in their notes. And translation committees for even significant versions, English versions, those are done by people with a particular perspective, theological perspective. So their selection of the very words they use to translate from Greek is involved theologically and comes through a particular lens. So there isn't anything that we can read anywhere, anytime, where we can let our guard down.
Without being careful, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So over on page 83, he notes that Dr. Metzger was chairman of the New Revised Standard Version Bible, NRSV is what we all know that as, a corresponding fellow of the British Academy, and he served on the curatorium of the Vetus Latina Institute at the monastery of Buron, Germany. Now, you know, guys are up there when they have served and worked at a place that none of the rest of us have ever heard of, you know, that kind of thing. I want to explain the Vetus Latina. The Vetus Latina is not, that's not the name necessarily cooked up for an institute. The Vetus Latina, it means Old Latin. It is a reference to the Latin translations of the Bible that preceded the Vulgata done by Jerome near the end of the 4th century. So this is a pre, I don't know, 380s, let's say. Yeah, because that's right, because Jerome was commissioned in 383. So it's pre-383 AD Latin translations of portions of the Bible, the Vetus Latina, all right? That's what he's talking about there. So second full paragraph on 83. If you scan, oh, yeah, well, that's what I said. If you scan the footnotes of any authoritative book on the text of the New Testament, the odds are you're going to see Metzger cited time after time. You can read, and I have read, scholarly papers on the New Testament where the footnotes are about 3/4 or 80% even Metzger. And his name just goes doink, 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 down the citations list. It's incredible. Let's move on. On page 84 at the bottom, he starts talking about copies of copies, of copies, okay? All right, oh, let me back up and mention part of a story I mentioned in the sermon today. I talked to, was it in the sermon? I think, I don't know, I think too much and then I don't know what I was thinking about. So the NRSV, all right? The NRSV follows on the heels of the release of the RSV. He was chairman of the original RSV translation and then was on the committee for the N or new RSV Revised Standard Version. This was the first critical text, that's the point. This is the first critical text, and we'll get to the details of what I mean when I say that, but for now, what I'm referring to is the use of the Alexandrian text type versus the Byzantine text type. I know that explains everything, but we'll come to that, all right? Anyway, it's the first Bible translation, the RSV, significant Bible translation that did not religiously, if you will, follow the King James Version. For this reason, it was very much not liked in fundamentalist circles. And so all the way until today, you get this King James only school of thought that has to do with what body of manuscripts your version of your Bible was translated from. I'm going to explain that in a lot of detail if we get to it today. Otherwise, you got to wait a week. Sorry. But anyway, that's what's going on. I'm sure you've heard that before. You have maybe heard that in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints circles, okay? King James only. There's a reason for that. There's an entire history behind that. We're going to talk about that. But the RSV, in 1952, a group of fundamentalists gathered together and burned all the copies they could find of that Bible because of one word. In Hebrews 1:9, the word for fellowship was changed, or fellows was changed to comrades. And fundamentalists decided that was communist, and so they were burning the new RSV Bible, all the copies they could find, because one word was changed. So you can see how uptight people get when things change in the Bible. We're going to get to a point where we talk about the difference between the Byzantine text type and the Alexandrian text type, the 16 verses, 8 partial verses in 2 sections that are not in or are boxed or otherwise noted in newer translations of the Bible. There's a reason for that. Well, when that all happened, boom, everybody went bananas. They're taking verses out of my Bible. And to this day, there are even Lutheran pastors in the LCMS who will only use English versions of the Bible that still have these passages in it. We'll talk about why they're not. It's a big deal. And even in our own circuit, there's at least one guy, when we want to study Greek, who, bless his heart, kind of takes over the discussion and goes back to why the Textus Receptus is better than the critical things that we're doing today, blah, blah, blah. All right, whatever. Just nod and say, okay, boomer, and eventually they go away. Yeah, no, just kidding.
You know, I like in this chapter, sort of following the page that we were just on, how Lee Strobel sort of characterizes Metzger as not like a stuffy old, you know, he uses kind of like older language, but he talks about how he's on the cutting edge. I mean, this is a living field of study, you know, and even the authority is not some entrenched old guy who's stuck in things. They're like looking at this with a critical eye all the time.
Yeah, no, these guys are awesome to talk to, and you will find that they aren't just brilliant, and believe me, they're head explodingly brilliant, but they have their intellectual curiosity knows no bounds. So Dr. Wells will talk to you about postmodernism expertly and at great length. He'll talk about decentering the self, and he'll pull that into any other field of study you want and show how it impacts it. I mean, and Metzger is like that. And the expression, I like how he talked about that quite so. It's not a quaint expression, it's a British expression. People who come back from Cambridge, they do that. Dr. Ronald Feuerhahn was one of my practical theology professors. He has now gone to be with the Lord. Brilliant. He had the entire history of Western philosophy in his head and taught that class at the seminary. And you would just bring Excedrin to class knowing you're going to need this, probably sooner rather than later. And he would put his notes out on the podium, then he'd walk around the front, lean on the desk, and do the whole thing off the cuff. And it would just bend your head. He had been to Cambridge, and he used all of these English expressions. Dr. Wells does that sometimes as well, and so does Dr. Metzger here in the book. It's a Cambridge thing. It's a little thing they do when they come back. So in 85, yes, 85, page 85, he starts talking about the unprecedented multiplicity of copies that have survived. This is a comparison to other works of antiquity. And it's very interesting. He will make the point, and it's absolutely true, that we have no other work of antiquity, no other work that has the kind of attestation, manuscript attestation that the New Testament has. There's nothing. Nobody seriously questions anything else. Nobody ever says, Homer didn't write the Iliad. You know, nobody ever says, Tacitus, we don't know anything about him. Cicero, whatever, Seneca, nobody ever says that. But when it comes to Scripture, and by the way, we have better attestation of the New Testament than we have of Shakespeare, which is much closer to us. Nobody questions any of this, but plenty of people question the Bible. It's not a matter of the unreliability of the manuscript evidence. It's a matter of bias. And it's very important for us to call it what it is, and to talk about it in that way. So he continues on page 85. The more you can cross-check them because of the multiplicity of copies, the better you begin to realize they go back genealogically to a family tree that represents the descent of the manuscripts. These manuscripts, scattered all over the world in very different cultures, different languages, different places, different kinds of congregations, they still all agree. And that's phenomenal when you consider the number of manuscripts that there are. So Metzger said, right after he says "quite so," about 2/3 of the way down page 85, Metzger says, "We have copies commencing within a couple of generations from the writing of the originals, whereas in the case of other ancient texts, maybe 5, 8, or 10 centuries elapsed between the original and the early surviving copy." That's huge. That's an enormous deal because those other things aren't questioned. In addition to the Greek manuscripts, we also have translations of the Gospels into other languages at a relatively early time. Latin, Syriac, Coptic. Beyond that, we have what may be called secondary translations made a little later, like Armenian and Gothic, and a lot of others. Georgian, Ethiopic, a great variety. And you can see these things, again, when they're translated out of those languages, there's massive agreement with each other such that while there are tiny little variations in some places between all of the manuscripts, and they're all documented, there isn't anything that fundamentally changes the theology at any point. And again, think about that, and just in terms of the number. The book quotes 5,600 and something. It was written a little while back. It was updated a little while back. The current number is over 5,800 manuscripts in evidence for the New Testament. And there's never disagreement enough between any two copies to fundamentally change any point of theology. That's nuts. I mean, that only happens by the power of the Holy Spirit. Metzger says, even if we didn't have all of that, even if we had no manuscripts today, no Greek manuscripts today, we could piece together the information from the translations from a relatively early date and actually reproduce the contents of the New Testament. In addition to that, even if we lost the Greek manuscripts and the early translations, we could still reproduce the contents of the New Testament from the multiplicity of quotations in the commentaries, sermons, letters, and so forth of the early church fathers. It's not just that we have more manuscript evidence for the New Testament than any other work of human history, but that we also have layers of evidence. We have other translations. We have commentaries, letters, and other things that we could reproduce the New Testament from any of that. On page 86, the section titled "A Mountain of Manuscripts," he starts getting into comparisons with other works of human history. At the bottom of the page there, that last partial paragraph beginning with a quote, "Consider Tacitus, the Roman historian who wrote the Annals of Imperial Rome in about AD 116, he began. His first 6 books, and that's among the Annals of the Imperial Rome, his first 6 books exist today in only one manuscript, and it was copied about AD 850, okay? Books 11 through 16 are in another manuscript dating from the 11th century. Books 7 through 10 are lost. So there is a long gap between the time that Tacitus sought his information and wrote it down, and then the only existing copies that we have today. But nobody questions whether Tacitus wrote that. That's the point. With regard to the first century historian Josephus, we have 9 Greek manuscripts of his work, The Jewish War. 9. And these copies were written in the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries. There is a Latin translation from the 4th century. There's a medieval Roman material from the 11th and 12th. But that's it. That's all you got. So Strobel asks him, how many New Testament Greek manuscripts are in existence today? Metzger's eyes got wide. More than 5,000 have been cataloged. Okay. There's nothing else in human history that comes even close. He'll go on to talk about, on page 87, Homer's Iliad is the next closest thing in terms of the sheer number of manuscripts in evidence. 650 Greek manuscripts exist today, From the 2nd and 3rd century and later, Homer wrote in 800 BC. So in other words, for the next best work of history in terms of attestation, we only have 650 copies, and the oldest one is 1,000 years after the fact. But nobody questions that. The New Testament, we have within 70 years of the biblical authors, and we have way over 5,000 copies, manuscripts in existence. There's just absolutely nothing that comes even close. On 88, he talks about the materials on which these documents were written. I've mentioned this before in the context of Old Testament transmission when we were actually physically in Bible study last year. But to kind of just mention again, the earliest material on which we have manuscript evidence for the New Testament is papyrus. That's made from a plant, a reed, that grows in the marshes of the Nile Delta. Those break down easy. That's plant material that breaks down more quickly. So we don't have a lot of those. The most significant papyrus to come to light are the Chester Beatty papyri discovered around 1930. Papyrus number 1 contains portions of the 4 Gospels in the book of Acts, and it dates from around the 3rd century. That's the 200s, right? No, 1, 2, 3, that's the 400s. Papyrus number 2 contains large portions of 8 letters of Paul, plus portions of Hebrews dating to about the year 200. That's phenomenal, how close that is to the time of writing. Now take note here, papyri are numbered in the order they're found. They are not chronologically numbered. So that's why in the Beatty collection, you have papyrus 1 from the 3rd century, which is the 400. And then you have papyrus 2, which sounds like it would be even older, but it's, newer, but it's older. It's from around 200. They're numbered in the order they're found. They're not ordered in the number that they were written, not chronologically, okay? There's another called the Bodmer collection. He mentions those. The earliest of these, dating from about 200 also, contains about 2/3 of the Gospel of Acts. And the reason why these are partials is because papyrus breaks down so easy, just crumbles. And even the kinds of ink they were using at the time, which largely dealt with plant dyes or the blood of animals mixed with plant dyes and things like that, this stuff goes bad, it flakes off. Even if your papyrus lasts, maybe your ink doesn't. It's really, really hard for these things to last. Contains about 2/3 of the Gospel of John, the Bodmer collection, from about 200, the earliest papyrus. There's another containing Gospels of Luke and John. That's from about the 3rd century. There's also, so the oldest fragment is a little, maybe 2 or 3 inch by 1.5 or something inch, little almost triangle shaped. It's got 3 verses of John on one side and 2 verses on the other from John 18. 5 verses altogether, 3 on the front, 2 on the back. And that was discovered in 1934. And that is in the Rylands Library. So it's called the Rylands Fragment, the Rylands Library in England. You can Google all the things he's mentioning in the book. You can Google them and you can see them. There's pictures of them online. That Rylands fragment of the Gospel of John in chapter 18 is from between AD 100 to 150. So now we're talking very, very close to the time of the autograph. And I would submit, and it's fun to think about, I just can't prove it, but I would submit, if we have in 2020 surviving fragments of papyri going back to 100, we may actually, and remember how these things are dated. They're dated by examining the writing style and dating them according to how the writing style of professional scribes changed over time in comparison with secular works. Because of that, it is possible that a fragment or a whatever may actually be of an autograph and we would have no way of knowing. We assume they've all crumbled. We assume that everything has gone away. But my point is, it's 2020 and we still have some of these. It's entirely possible that some of the super old ones could actually be autographs and we don't even realize it. That's okay. On the safe side, we say, well, we'll treat them like they're copies. Who knows? I mean, we don't have a way to know. All right, let's move ahead. Any questions so far on this stuff?
No, but I'm glad that you mentioned about Googling. I was actually doing that as we were talking about the Bodmer libraries and stuff like that. This stuff is essentially, and this is not a pun, but it's basically an open book. I mean, this field of study, they keep them in, museums and in libraries, and the Vatican buys some, and who knows, but it's not like a secret hidden enclave of people, keeping it secret. Like, oh, you can literally look at it.
Yeah, and thank you, because that's so incredibly important, especially when you're talking to somebody who's trying to make the case that the Bible is corrupted, or they're treating it like Constantine changed the Bible and it's this secret blah, blah, blah. No, it's not. You at home or anywhere you are with your phone, you can look up all of this stuff and it's right there. You can look at images of the plates. You can see the papyri and so forth. Parchment was a later material that was used. Animal hides dried in the sun, again, being organic matter, eventually they fall apart, although they've done a better job of surviving than the papyri, and they tend to be newer. That's the other material. By the way, I have had my hands on some of these. Concordia Seminary in St. Louis has a world-class scriptorium on its campus. And they can take researchers and scholars from around the world in there. They took us. I took a couple of graduate classes as electives my last year. And as part of one of those graduate classes, we were taken into the scriptorium, and where we had our gloved hands on some incredibly ancient manuscripts. And that was super cool and super terrifying at the same time, because you're touching this thing and you bust it or crumble it, you've just nuked something irreplaceable.
You bought it.
Yeah.
I wanted to add one extra thing too, which is that the locations and the custody of these documents, they are not all churchy people either. It's not all like people who have a vested interest in the, in the I don't want to call it the veracity, but they don't have a doctrinal standpoint on it. It's like museums and archaeological institutions that are just interested in the fact that it is archaeological. So it's not like, the cool thing, it's almost really cool that it's so decentralized all over the world and in a variety of people's hands, and that it's open to study so that people who do have interest in those things have access to like really verifiably ancient and legitimate, essentially, documentation.
Absolutely. Nothing about this is hidden, not a single thing. And these ancient manuscripts have been digitally imaged in safe ways, so that should they fall apart, break, crumble, whatever, we've still got this information now. And again, you can just go online and look at it. They'll show you. You can pay for and have shipped to you professionally made plates of these things. They'll just give them to you and you can look at them. So there's nothing, absolutely nothing hidden. There's nothing secret. Anybody, any scholar, you don't have to be a part of a church. Anybody can see this information for themselves. And to me, this reminds me of John 3. The one who believes brings his works into the light, that it may be seen that what he does is of God. The best thing to do is bring everything out in the light, have everything on the table, let it be seen, and now we can all know what the truth is. And that's absolutely what this kind of stuff is. On page 90, he starts talking about parchment made from the skin of cattle, sheep, goats, and antelope. And then he begins talking about kinds of Greek writing. This is super significant because we're going to get into the Alexandrian and Byzantine text types. Looks like probably next week. Sorry. Unseal manuscript. Unseal refers to a kind of Greek writing that is all capital letters. Okay? That is, it's also called majuscules. Like majesty, a majuscule is an uppercase style of Greek writing. Later, sort of a cursive form in what is taught at the seminary, minuscule writing was developed. Majuscule or unseal is uppercase. Minuscule is lowercase, and it helps us date manuscripts because the writing changed. So your unseal manuscripts, all caps, there are 306 of these in existence today, dating back as early as the 3rd century. The most important are Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. Codex Sinaiticus, I mentioned in a sermon, I think it was 2 weeks ago maybe. A professor in England had made friends with people at the monastery of St. Catherine's on Mount Sinai. They had a scriptorium and they had all these ancient documents in there. They didn't know what they were, and they were actually using them to start fires and keep warm in the winter. No kidding. They were burning ancient scrolls and manuscripts. Yeah. So the professor finds out about this. He's making friends with them. He just like vapor locks and says, let me come see what this is first before you burn any more of it. He sends over twin sisters who go over there and discover what is still today the earliest known manuscript of the 4 Gospels together in one place. Blew his mind. He goes rushing over there, and the rest is history. Okay, open this door. That is Codex Sinaiticus. Oh, by the way, so a lot of these manuscripts, you've noticed maybe already, they are named by who found them, or they are named by where they were found, Codex Sinaiticus, or they're named by where they're kept, Ryland Papyri, Codex Vaticanus. Those are kind of the 3 main ways of naming where a manuscript either comes from, where it's stored, or who found it. And those designations are all given either Greek letters in majuscule or minuscule, or numbers or sets of numbers and other coded designations, so that when you look at, for example, your Greek New Testament, I'm going to set the Case for Christ down, and I'm going to show you, okay, can you see that at the bottom, all the squigglies? Okay, this is the Nestle Aland 27 Greek critical manuscript. This is what I was required to use in the seminary. I still use today. If you go online and look up Greek manuscript translation, you'll find probably Nestle Aland. Those are the guys that did this, 27. Down here, the critical apparatus, all of those weird markings refer to individual manuscripts that may have a slightly different reading than that verse associated with it in the text. Those squigglies, and there's a whole index to how to read these, tells you where to go find. You can go find that manuscript, and then you can go read, okay, what do they have different there? This also tells you what the difference is and why it is or isn't significant. So think about that. Every single manuscript, in part or in whole, including fragments, has a specific designation used around the world in critical apparatus to say, look, John 17, verse 11, there are 3 variants out of all of the manuscripts, 5,800 something. There are 3 variants. Here are those 3. So again, it's wide open to the world. Nobody can say you're hiding anything. This isn't in the dark. Anybody can pick this up and look at it, get the index and say, oh yeah, that's the manuscript where the variant comes from. They can see what the variant is and see that it doesn't change the meaning. Yeah, I'm going to put this back down and go back to the book. By the way, the Old Testament has equal attestation. So there's a critical apparatus for the Biblica Stuttgartensia, Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartensia, first translation made in Stuttgart, manuscript found in Stuttgart in 1000 AD, but this isn't an Old Testament class. We're talking about the New Testament. Same thing though, there's a critical apparatus. So he's talking about unseals and majuscules. A new style of writing, more cursive in nature, emerged in roughly 8800. That's a big difference. It's called minuscule, and we have 2,856 of these manuscripts, okay? This again is going to come into play later when we start talking about the difference between the Alexandrian and the Byzantine families of text. There are two others as well, the Caesarean, for example, and the Western. But nothing impacts your Bible in English in your hands like the Alexandrian and Byzantine text types that we're going to talk about. Then there also are lectionaries, which contain New Testament scripture in the sequence it was to be read in the early churches at the appropriate times during the year. And we've got 2,403 of these cataloged. That puts the grand total of Greek manuscripts at 5,664. There are even more today. This is, years later, over 5,800. In addition, this is on page 91 in the Case for Christ. In addition, there are thousands of other ancient New Testament manuscripts in other languages. There are 8,000 to 10,000 Latin Vulgate manuscripts, plus a total of 8,000 in Ethiopic, Slavic, and Armenian. In all, there are about 24,000 manuscripts in existence. You'll hear me use that 5,800 number and not the 24,000 number. That's because in the seminary, we were required to work on and study that original body of Greek manuscripts that numbers right around 5,800. It includes Syriac, Coptic, and some other things that are pulled into the Nestle-Aland critical apparatus. But that's that kind of, we go right to the heart of things. This is what Lutherans do. We've got a history of this since Martin Luther himself. He went to the top of the heap, had himself taught Greek and Hebrew by the best. And ever since then, we've been all about this stuff. That's what Lutherans do. Bottom of 91, he's quoting F.F. Bruce. I mentioned him earlier. World-renowned, he's passed away now, world-renowned scholar, Greek New Testament scholar. He says, there is no body of ancient literature in the world, okay, which enjoys such a wealth of good textual attestation as the New Testament. Sir Frederick Kenyon, former director of the British Museum and author of the Paleography of Greek Papyri, Kenyon has said, in no other case is the interval of time between the composition of a book and the date of the earliest manuscripts as short as it is of the New Testament. He concludes, the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed. These are world-class, ultimate scholars in Greek New Testament, all saying there is no doubt that the Bible in your hands is essentially what was written in the autographs by the hand of the inspired writers at that time. That's pretty epic. It just doesn't get better than that. And there's no other attestation for any work of history like this. Nothing compares. Any questions so far?
I just wanted to make one quick callback. Actually, I find it kind of interesting that this is chapter 3 and not earlier in the book. And I wonder if it's just because it's so dense, like it's a little hard to follow. But it seems to me that the discussion of the material on which we've received, the writing, it seems like it would sort of precede all the discussion of the people who wrote and kind of what the content is. But I think this is a good foundation. I wanted to make a quick callback to one of the previous chapters. You were talking about in the critical apparatus there, all the different little symbols, the majuscule symbols in Greek, and and just kind of call back to a discussion earlier, if everybody remembers when they were talking about this hypothetical document Q. And that's the same kind of thing. Everything has a name or a number, and sometimes it's not even an English or a Romanized. It's like, I don't even know how to pronounce some of this stuff. And if you are interested, I've actually, one of the reasons why I'm able to follow you through this is because I've actually been looking at that Wells book, and I was kind of interested to share. And I don't know if anybody wants to see. If you feel like it's hard to hear somebody talk about it, I would be interested in sharing with you what it looks like to read about it, because
and this is something I would like to do, is actually have a higher level class on Wells's book. So Dr. Wells wrote a book called What Does This Mean? And that book is a primer, and it comes from his again, his vast experience and his graduate work at Cambridge on how to interpret the Bible and interpretation problems and how do you do all of it. That book was published and became a required seminary text in St. Louis. His PhD student in 2000, Jeff Cloa, who is now Reverend Dr. Jeff Cloa, who went on to become the provost of the seminary in St. Louis and now is the director of ancient manuscripts at the Museum of the Bible. Dr. Cloa is a friend of mine as well. And he was the first one to teach that, other than Wells, was the first one to teach that class, and I was in his first class. So as a student, I took to that like a duck takes to water. That's in my wheelhouse. I love that stuff, that interpretive stuff. And so I became Dr. Cloa's first assistant. I graded all the tests and the papers for Cloa the rest of my time in seminary. So I have a love for that book and would love to teach it at Grace and explain. But I do want you to understand how much fun it is. That book by other seminary professors at both seminaries is often referred to as it's called What Does This Mean? They say, what the heck does this mean? But they don't say heck.
Yeah.
And it requires, you just need to know we're going to have some fun, and it requires a little horsepower, and that's okay. And it's dense, like Wellsian dense. And it gives you a little insight into Wells to take a look at it. It's awesome.
It is. Pastor took me into his library once and he's like, hey, let's look at some books together. Look at all these interesting books. What's one that you think would be good to look at? And I saw, What Does This Mean? And I'm like, oh, that's pretty Lutheran sounding. That looks, pretty basic. What does this mean? Oh my gosh, you guys. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I say, oh, you should get that. It's awesome. And it's a lot of fun. Bring Excedrin. Yeah. The next section, 92, goes into examining the errors. Okay. He says, Strobel asks him, aren't there literally tens of thousands of variations among the ancient manuscripts that we have? And Metzger characteristically answers, quite so. And he says, for example, eyeglasses weren't invented until 1373 in Venice. And I'm sure that astigmatism existed among the ancient scribes. Think about their eyesight problems. They're working by candlelight in caves or in dark monastery rooms. They're squinting. Remember the expense of papyrus and parchment, very expensive. And so you're going to write small to make the most out of the high-priced material that you're writing on. They're squinting in candlelight in dark places in tiny print. That had to ruin their eyes. And it's not like professional scribes were on every corner. You couldn't roll up to the library and 10 guys are out front waiting to be hired to transcribe scripture. It didn't work like that. These are highly educated guys. This is an expensive process. So yeah, mistakes happened. They're reading faded manuscripts. I mentioned this earlier, some of the ink flakes off. There could be scribal inattentiveness. I mean, when you're in a dark room in candlelight hour after hour after hour, you might miss a detail, a dot or something, somewhere. Sometimes the scribe's memory would play tricks on him. If he's tired enough, from the time he looks at the manuscript and reaches over here and writes that, did he remember every line and every dot? There can be misspellings, and all of these things happen. Here's the interesting thing. You can see it. See? So the argument that, there's tens of thousands or whatever, no. You can see every bit of it, just like you and I could see it. If I wrote the sentence, I drove my car to the store and I forget the period, you all can see that. And this is how that works. Or if I write, I drove my car to the store, but I add an E and it's care, you can figure out that I drove a car and not a care. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about when critics want to make a big deal out of, there are changes, there are problems. You can see exactly what they are. Did you have a question, Steph? Okay. I'm anticipating. All right, very good. So he talks about these kinds of problems, and Metzger goes on to say, he may write down the right words even, but in a different sequence, because it didn't matter. Greek is an inflected language. Word order doesn't mean it's different than English. I can't say drive car the I store or whatever. I can't do that in English. The words have to be in a certain order. Greek is inflected. It's like Latin. Word order is not super significant. The subject is the subject of the sentence, no matter where it is. You can look at the ending. The predicate is the predicate, no matter where you can look at the ending. The object is the object. The adjective is the adjective. And you can put an adjective that modifies something and stick the other word way at the end. They're paired up because they share the same, they have the same ending. You know what goes with what. So, this just isn't an issue, this stuff that they bring up. The meaning of the sentence isn't distorted, Metzger says, if the words are out of order. So yes, some variations among manuscripts exist, but generally they're inconsequential variations like that. Differences in spelling are another example. Metzger goes on to say, I don't know of any doctrine that is in jeopardy. He responded confidently. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses will come to your door and say, your Bible is wrong in the King James Version of 1 John 5, 7 through 8. Okay, where it talks about the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. They'll say, that's not in the earliest manuscripts, and that's true enough. I think that these words are found only in about 7 or 8 copies, all from the 15th or 16th century. I acknowledge that it is not part of what the author of 1 John was inspired to write. They're talking about the phrase, and these three are one. That was added later. But you can see that because we have the manuscripts. But that does nothing to dislodge the firmly witnessed testimony of the Bible to the doctrine of the Trinity. At the baptism of Jesus, Metzger says, the Father speaks, the Son is baptized, the Spirit descends on him. The ending of 2 Corinthians, Paul says, may the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ and the love of God and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be with you all. And there are many other places where the Trinity is represented. Okay. And he also makes note that any good English translation, any good version will make notes down below of any variations there are in the text. The Lutheran Study Bible does that, for example. So he moves on to a high degree of unanimity on page 95 in chapter 3. And he talks about the 3 criteria, ancient criteria for the canon. This is huge because everybody wants to know, how were those decisions made? Why 27 books? Why not 28? What about this other stuff that comes up, like at the Nag Hammadi find in 1945? What about the Gospel of Thomas? What about the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, Paul's letter to the Laodiceans? Okay, he's going to deal with that kind of stuff in this section. Here are the 3 criteria that the ancient church used to form canon. Remember, canon is from the Greek word kanon. It means a rule, a measurement, a way to figure out, what's right. First rule, first canon, first. The books must have apostolic authority. That is, they must have been written by either the apostles themselves, who were eyewitnesses to what they wrote about, or by their own followers, the students of the apostles. So in the case of Mark and Luke, okay, while they weren't among the 12 apostles, early tradition has it that Mark was a helper of Peter and Luke was an associate of Paul. Okay, why is this significant? It's huge because Hebrews 1 says that in the past, in ancient days, our fathers heard from the prophets in many and various ways. Okay, God spoke through the prophets, rather. God spoke through the prophets in many and various ways. But now he has spoken to us through his Son. Jesus handpicked the apostles. Jesus didn't write these books. He handpicked the apostles who then wrote these books. He handpicked Paul, who wrote the 17 letters, and their immediate students like Mark and Luke so the apostles are still alive to transmit to these students these things that they wrote and double check it. That is why the canon is closed after the apostolic age. Those guys are done and gone. In addition, the Old Testament, particularly in Deuteronomy, sets the standard for who is a prophet. One of the standards is that miracles have to be worked by that prophet in the name of God, along with the prophecies coming true. 2 Corinthians 12:12 records this. This is not in your book. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 12, Paul writes, the signs of an apostle were done among you. He's saying to the Corinthians, There are false teachers out there. Let them do miracles. Paul's saying you can help verify who's an authentic apostle handpicked by Jesus Christ because they work signs and wonders just like the Old Testament prophets did.
You know, if I remember correctly, that was also one of the sort of the qualifications for Old Testament prophets too, right? I mean, there was
Deuteronomy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. You can look in Deuteronomy 4, 12, and 18, especially chapter 18, Deuteronomy 18. Yeah. Second criteria. So the first one, it had to have apostolic authority, or they're just going to throw it out because they know whoever's writing this was not an eyewitness or a student of an eyewitness. Second, there was the criterion of conformity to what was called the rule of faith. Many times throughout a number of times in the New Testament, particularly in the epistles, there is a reference to what I preached to you, or the word tradition will show up. It's not tradition in the Roman Catholic sense where the church is kind of named tradition so that whatever they say is an gradual unfolding of dogma. No, they're talking about the apostolic preaching. So again, we're going to apostolic authority. So what was written had to agree with what they wrote. So you'll find, for example, in the Gospel of Thomas, which is a Gnostic work much later, weird things attributed to Jesus that he definitely didn't say, like pantheistic things, like cut the wood and you'll find me there, break the rock and you'll find me there, like God is in everything. It's really panentheism, but pantheism is close enough. Stuff like that. Well, that guy, whoever the anonymous author was who's pretending to be Thomas, he wasn't around, and these things clearly aren't things that Jesus ever would have said. So it had to measure up it had to conform with the apostolic teaching, which everybody knew because they either were in the apostolic age, the apostles were there and present, could say what was right or wrong, or they had stuff written by the apostles or their known students to compare these other writings to and say, yeah, that doesn't line up, okay? And finally, the third criterion was whether a document had a continuous acceptance and usage by the church at large. Okay, and what you will find is, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are accepted from the beginning in every church, in every place, point blank. That there's never a time when some community of faith, I don't know, in Spain or somewhere, pops up and says, yeah, no, Mark didn't write this. That just never happens. The letters of Paul and so forth. Now, there are 7 of the 27 books. They are called the pseudepigrapha. They are, they were for a time in a minority, not all places. There were some questions. These are things like James. Depending on the place, it could have been Hebrews. 2nd and 3rd Peter, 2nd Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Jude, Revelation. So there were there were 7 pseudepigrapha books that maybe a church here and there had some questions about, but kept reading on Sunday. But by, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, they are definitely accepted by the whole church. Rather than causing question about the canon of the New Testament, it actually shows how careful the church was. The church wanted definitely to know exactly, does this measure up to these 3 criteria? Does it measure up to the rule? Is this the word of God? That's how careful they were to even take some of the writings that are now universally considered the word of God, to rethink them over a period of time and go, yeah, you know what? Yeah, these are it.
Interestingly, also when it comes to, and you're talking here also, I guess, about antilegomena, which I kind of miss whether you actually used that word, but in some of those early councils, there were, for example, the book of Hebrews, the author is anonymous, and so it's kind of like, well, and even Luther, was sometimes like, well, I don't know. Even though they're established in the canon, an interesting thing that I heard about this is that no dogma is accepted by the Church Catholic for something that has its basis only in a book that's from the Antilegomena. For example, you've sometimes talked and preached about the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and one of the reasons why there are, I don't know how to actually articulate this, but it's not a set thing that everybody is in exact agreement about it, because that thing is only really talked about there, and so we accept it in the canon, but we're also very careful about what kinds of things in those cases are doctrine and dogma.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So it's really within the first 2 centuries. I wanted to double check here in the book on page 96, that these 7 books, and it wasn't all 7 at the same time. It wasn't all 7 in the same place. It was a stray book or 2 here and there in different churches. But it's only in the first 2 centuries. And by the end of that time period, you have a list. And that reminds me, in ancient letters and other things, commentaries that we have copies of still today, going all the way back into the 2nd century and early in the 2nd century, you will find lists of the New Testament books that very much look like exactly what you have today. So this was not a widespread question. This was not something that anyone ever thought called into question the other books, the 20 that always were accepted from the beginning. It's something that critics use today to try to make a thing out of it that isn't a thing. It's just revealing their bias. Arthur Knock at Harvard says, the most traveled roads in Europe are the best roads, and that's why they're so heavily traveled. It's an analogy to how to figure out what belongs in Scripture. When you have these communities of faithful spread all over the ancient world, all using the same 27 books, there's a reason for that, and there's a reason why they weren't using these things at the Nag Hammadi find, like the Gospel of Mary or whatever. William Barclay, British scholar, says, it's a simple truth to say that the New Testament books became canonical because no one could stop them doing so. So contrary to modern day critics, the ancient church didn't sit down and say, let me see, what do I think belongs in here? No. They were from the beginning using these things that they considered to be the Word of God. And it was because nobody could prove they weren't that they didn't. It's the reverse of what the critics are saying, in other words. Those who discerned the limits of the canon had a clear and balanced perspective of the gospel of Christ. Okay, in the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth century, long after Jesus, that's the time of the Gnostic Gospels, and you'll find that they're very, very different. Where the New Testament books clearly are historical, clearly are written by eyewitnesses, and clearly intend to present a historical Jesus. The Gnostic Gospels are fanciful, mythical. They obviously don't belong. He mentions the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Mary. And then he gets into the Gospel of Thomas at the bottom of page 97. In the Nag Hammadi find, 1945 in Egypt, claims to be the secret words which the living Jesus spoke and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote down. And Strobel wants to know, why was that excluded by the church? If there's any Gnostic work that I hear about most often as though there was some kind of conspiracy to not include it, it's going to be the Gospel of Thomas. It's 5th century, and it's in Coptic, okay? So the original, that's our copy, the original seems to have been in Greek and come from Syria, and may be as early as 2nd century, but you can tell that some of the things are copied from the Gospels and slightly modified, and some of the things are completely made up. For example, there's a quote, "A city built on a high hill cannot be hidden." Sounds just like Matthew. The word high has been added, not a huge deal, but he's clearly copying. Or, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's." That's copied, but then he adds, "Render to me the things that are mine." He has Jesus saying that. It's an added phrase. But then it gets really weird. The Gospel of Thomas ends with a note saying, "Let Mary go away from us because women are not worthy of life." Jesus then says, "Lo, I shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who makes herself male will enter into the kingdom of heaven." What? I mean, it's crazy. That's in the Gospel of Thomas that critics, want to make a big deal out of and say, oh, there's a conspiracy to not add these sayings of Jesus. He didn't say that. He wouldn't have said that. It's ridiculous. That's the kind of thing you find in the Gnostic Gospels. Whack. So the critics then also go to things like the 5th century, where there, an ecumenical council mentions the canon and says these are the 27 books. And they like to point at that and say that was the church 5 centuries after Christ, assembling these works according to what they wanted in there. That's all baloney. That stuff was already being used from the beginning. Already by the 2nd century, we have the list that's all laid out. The 5th century council is simply confirming what we've known all along. And Metzger uses an example of this. He says it's like saying, let's get several academies of musicians to make a pronouncement that the music of Bach and Beethoven is wonderful. And I would say, thanks for nothing. We already knew that before the pronouncement was made. That's what it was like in the 5th century to say, oh yes, this is the official canon of the Roman Catholic Church. Well, thanks. It's been that way for 5 centuries already. So I guess it's nice to have in the records. Even so, Strobel points out James, Hebrews, Revelation were more slowly accepted into the canon. Should we be suspicious? And again, Metzger says, to my mind, that just shows how careful the church was being. On 101, he quotes scholar Benjamin Warfield, who had 4 PhDs in this stuff, saying, here's the quote on 101, if we compare the present state of the New Testament text with that of any other ancient writing, we must declare it to be marvelously correct. I love that phraseology, marvelously correct. Such has been the care with which the New Testament has been copied, a care which has doubtless grown out of true reverence for its holy words. The New Testament is unrivaled among ancient writings in the purity of its text as actually transmitted and kept in use. Absolutely incredible. Awesome statement there. There's never been any, Strobel goes on to point out, this is in Metzger's words, there's never been any serious dispute about the authoritative nature of 20 of the New Testament's 27 books, from Matthew through Philemon or Philemon, however you want to say it, plus 1 Peter and 1 John, okay? This, of course, includes the 4 Gospels that represent Jesus' biographies. Look at the last full paragraph on 101. As for the pseudepigrapha, the proliferation of Gospels, epistles, and apocalypses of the first few centuries. Oop, let me correct myself. I just realized I said pseudepigrapha earlier. Jeremy, you said antilegomena. That's the right term for the readings, the 7 of them that were a little bit in question in a few churches is antilegomena. I got ahead of myself. Pseudepigrapha are the Gnostic Gospels and the things that they don't belong. They don't belong. Pseudepigrapha, including Gospel of Nicodemus, Gospel of Barnabas, Gospel of Bartholomew, Gospel of Andrew. Here's the Epistle of Paul to the Laodiceans, the Apocalypse of Stephen. They're just fanciful and heretical, Metzger says, which nails it down. On 102, he mentions Eusebius. That's my launching point for next week. And when we talk about the history of the New Testament text in your Bible, and everything I'm going to give you next week is not in this book. So, but stay tuned because it's epic. He talks about Eusebius, and I'm just going to leave that there. But he mentions that the pseudepigrapha have mythical qualities about them that don't in any way, shape, or form act like a verifiable history of a major figure like Jesus. So that takes us to the end of chapter 3. I'm rushing that a little bit because you can read this. It's in the book. And I want to get to what you can't read, which is Wells's scholarly work that is not yet published, which traces from the beginning, from the writing of the apostles to the ESV 2001 ESV translation in your hands. And we're going to start on that next week. And you're going to get it pre-publication first before anybody else. This will also include a lot of my own research that I'm adding to what Dr. Wells has presented, because I've continued working on this since February. It's just this past February he presented it to the circuit pastors. And you're going to get all of that starting next week. Yeah. Any questions? Okay, stay tuned because next week we are going to go for a whale of a ride. It's going to be fun. We're going to talk about English versions, how they're different, where they came from, the Alexandrian text type, the Byzantine text type, the Western, the Caesarean. It's going to be a blast. So
Everybody practice your majuscules and minuscules.
yeah, right. Tell you what, let's close with the words our Savior taught us. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Peace be with you. So why do I make the sign of the cross where I do before the end? The reason is because that's where the prayer actually ends. If you look at Matthew, if you look at Luke, the Lord's Prayer ends, and then for thine is the kingdom, power, and glory, etc. All of that from that point on is added. It was added very early, not a problem. It was an early response to that prayer and the beauty of it. It's a greatly expanded amen kind of a thing. So I make the cross for thine for thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory, which is the response to the actual prayer. Not a big deal. You're not wrong if you do it another way. You just get far much more street cred if you do it that way. No, that's where the prayer actually ends. Hey, the Lord be with you. Thank you for joining. I recommend reading chapter 3 again, highlighting before next week. Let's get your questions about chapter 3 answered, because this is child's play compared to where we're going. And I want to make sure those questions are answered about this really basic stuff before we get to the actual fun stuff, okay? The Lord be with you. God bless your day and your week. And I'll see you soon. God bless you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Pastor. God's peace. God's peace, everybody.